on. The Mail on Sunday reports that there are now nearly 1 million victims of crime across England and Wales who withdrew their support for a prosecution in just the last year alone. 1 million. That now makes up more than 1 in every 5 of those victims who could otherwise have had their case heard in court. They have now decided that they don't want that to happen anymore. As a proportion, that's 3 times as many people as the amount who withdrew their support for prosecution back in 2014. In response to this, the government is saying it's doing more than ever to build back confidence in the justice system. Nobody has ever done more. It's more than anybody has ever done, believe me. Now, a little earlier, I spoke to Daw QC. He's a criminal barrister at the Millennium Chambers. He is also the author of the book Justice on Trial. And I asked him what he makes of this claim from the government.
Anybody who believes that is living in la-la land, because if you go to any criminal court in the country, you will hear the same thing, which is delay after delay after delay, files going missing, inquiries not made by the police, delay after delay. And what happens to a victim when faced with yet another delay, yet another adjournment? They just say, I've had enough, and they throw in the towel.
When you say files go missing, who's losing them?
Well, the files are often not at court, or the right papers are not on the file at the Crown Prosecution Service, sometimes at probation service. Police officers don't turn up with the right evidence for the case. Now, much of this is not the fault of those individuals. It's the fault of a system that is so overstretched and so underfunded that it's frankly on the verge of collapse. And you could almost argue that it's already collapsed, given the figures that you've just outlined at the beginning. 1 million victims a year saying, I've had enough. I mean, what kind of a system is that?
Well, the government, I'm sure, would say that, the reason for this is COVID. We've just gone through an unprecedented period of national emergency, and this has affected all sorts of things, including the criminal justice system. There's nothing they could do about it.
Yeah, well, of course they would say that, wouldn't they? But the problem with that analysis is that if I was to go back in a time machine to February 2020 or the end of 2019, the system was completely collapsed then. So the fact that COVID came along and, of course, led to more delays at one end of the system has had an effect on everyone. But the truth of it is that the criminal justice system is so chronically underfunded and understaffed, and has been for well over a decade, that it simply cannot fulfil the function that we as a society want from it, which is to try and keep us safer and try and reduce the amount of crime and try and take dangerous people out of society. It's failing on almost every front.
Well, you say that those are the kind of things that we're looking at. What sort of cases are cropping up that people are just giving up on? Is it the sort of thing where a neighbour's hedge is hanging over my property, or something more serious than that? No,
much more serious than that. So I'm advising a number of clients at the moment. So obviously I can't reveal any details other than the very broad headlines, but a number of clients who have been the victims of some of the most serious crimes that you can imagine. And one young woman I'm representing was a victim of rape, and that rape took place in January 2020. We're now at September 2021, and despite all of the sort of COVID delays, trials have not been delayed that long. Well, her case has been delayed so many times because of the police failing to properly download a mobile phone, because of all sorts of other delays along the way in terms of the police gathering evidence or the defence being ready, and defence is chronically underfunded as well. And as a result of that young woman is going to have to wait until well into next year, so well after 2 years after being raped. And frankly, she's almost come to the end of her tether, and you can see why even someone who's a victim of a crime as serious as that would eventually say, I've just had enough, and I just can't deal with it anymore.
So presumably she and people like her, the victims of violent crime, are most likely living near the people who have committed those crimes against them.
Well, one of the awful things that has happened, and you make a very good point about that, is that there's been a big increase in the number of suspects being granted bail in cases like that, in rape cases, even where there may be multiple victims and multiple allegations. All of the delays that we've seen have led to an increased amount of bail being granted because of a whole range of reasons, but predominantly because you can't keep people in custody for several years before they've even been tried. And so, sadly, the client I've just mentioned is in this position, as I'm sure many others are, which is that because of the delays in the system. He was originally in custody and she felt relatively safe. But because of all of those delays in the system, he was granted bail. So you can just imagine the fear that inspires in victims, and many of them, maybe particularly, I think, in cases of sexual violence and particularly in cases of domestic violence, the victims, whether they be male or female, are so frightened as a result of the system not looking after them and not protecting them, they just will not carry on with it because they think that's the only option they have left.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that the Conservatives position themselves as the party of law and order, and yet their record on it has been to charge in the opposite direction. I mean, is it fair to say there has never been a better time to be a criminal than under the current administration?
Well, I think that's true, but that's true for reasons that don't just relate to the last sort of year or two or three since the last general election. They go all the way back to the huge cuts in the criminal justice system in terms of vast numbers of police officers, dozens, if not hundreds, of courts closing down, huge reductions in the funding available for both prosecution and defence in criminal cases. All of that has been ongoing for over a decade. So this government is just the icing on the cake for a system that was already, at the point of collapse and has been for, I've been in practice for almost 30 years. And I would say that in the last 5 years, the system is an absolute travesty of that which existed when I started out in my career. It's a totally different place, the justice system. And whether it's better for criminals or not better for criminals, who knows? All I know is it doesn't work in reducing crime. We've got the government, basically, their only solution to everything is to lock people in prison for longer and build more prisons. And none of that achieves anything for our society. So we're just seeing a situation where the whole of the professional criminal justice system, that's police officers, probation officers, prison officers and lawyers like me, all of us are saying the same thing. This system has collapsed. It's been collapsing for well over a decade. And if you don't do something about it, we will see a crime explosion in our country and we will see a scale of human misery in some communities which we haven't seen for a very long time.
Now, the government are also, they're seemingly, protesting that it's not their fault and they are, investing record sums and et cetera and so on. But they also seem to be attacking the very system that they profess to support. They've been quite vocal about what they call activist lawyers, and magistrates who rule against them are enemies of the people. It's a weird position for somebody on the right side of the law to be, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very strange phenomenon that you have a government on the one hand trumpeting the success of the system and then essentially sort of deconstructing and criticising almost every component of that system. But that's politics. I mean, I understand the politics of criminal justice. I've been in the system a long time, and every time there's an election, the two sides tend to divide around those who are seen to want to get tough on crime and those who are seen to be too liberal. And those sort of two extremes are always reflected in one thing, which is how can we just lock people up for longer? So I think that was the platform upon which Boris Johnson and Priti Patel stood for election in December 2019, and they've increased, the length of sentences in all sorts of ways. But there is something very sinister when the government and the most senior members of the government responsible for criminal justice are so aggressive in attacking those of us who work within it and do our best to keep the system going and to make it fair and just on behalf of your listeners.
Now, Priti Patel has said that her number one priority is to push dinghies back out to sea. What do you think the Home Secretary's number one priority should be?
Well, I think if she sat down with the young woman I was talking to you about earlier, who was raped almost 2 years ago and is pulling her hair out and utterly distraught because of the delays in the criminal justice system and the underfunding of the police, which is a huge issue. If Priti Patel were to sit down with her and the hundreds, if not thousands, if not 1 million victims of crime under her watch, who are giving up on those cases, she might realise that dinghy watching is not the most productive use of the Home Secretary's time in our society.
Just on the detail, is 20,000 in their words, more police officers, which is, not, of course, not more. It's getting the numbers back to almost where they were 10 years ago, before the Conservative Party took over. Is 20,000 police officers going to be enough?
No, it's not. And of course, the problem is that when you recruit new officers, probationary constables, as many of them, if not most of them, still are, you're then creating an enormous training issue. In comparison to retaining the numbers that you had of very experienced officers, we now have a cohort of 20,000 extremely inexperienced police officers, and we've seen in total almost 50,000 police officers and police staff combined dispensed with in just over a decade. And so the idea that 20,000 new constables recruited at the very bottom end of policing are going to make even a dent in the problem that we face in our society with all sorts of crimes going undetected and victims giving up, it needs an enormously greater investment. If anything, what it needed was to say, rather than recruiting 20,000 just to say we've matched the numbers, why don't we see about some of those relatively recently retired and fairly young officers with great experience, because many retire in the sort of early 50s. Let's see about bringing them back in large numbers if we can make the tax arrangements and the compensation arrangements work, because it would be much better to have 10,000 highly experienced officers than 20,000 new recruits, all of whom have to be trained by more senior officers whose time is therefore taken away from day-to-day policing. So it's just a gimmick, the 20,000. It's an utter gimmick, and the fact that they never mention the vast number of police staff that they haven't replaced and haven't committed to replace tells you just how politically inept this entire process is.
You know, there may be some people thinking, oh, well, this chap's a lawyer. He's probably one of those legal aid millionaires that we read about in the newspaper. Do lawyers on legal aid actually get the vast sums that have been reported?
Absolutely not. And that's one of the most disgusting myths that's been promulgated by the government over the years, is about this idea of fat cat legal aid lawyers. It's absolute nonsense. If you were to reach out, go to any court centre in the country, whether it's magistrates or Crown Court, speak to the barristers and the young lawyers who are working there day in, day out, doing some of the most traumatic and difficult cases, you know, domestic violence and assault cases. Many of those are so badly funded that they're being dealt with by very young lawyers in their early to mid-20s in some cases, with only a couple of years of experience, and ask those young lawyers, how much do you get paid for doing this incredibly important, incredibly challenging and incredibly difficult work? And the answer will be, on average, less than you would get paid for being a shift supervisor at McDonald's. That's the truth. Under £20,000. Many junior barristers and young lawyers are making less than £20,000 a year after years and years of very expensive law school, with huge debts and with a commitment to society that is only matched by others with an extreme commitment to public service, like doctors and nurses and teachers and those who serve our society. Young lawyers doing their best and being paid very little get no reward, and it does no one any credit to categorise all lawyers as fat cats, or legal aid fat cats at that.
If the government were to come and we're listening to this and they were to have one plan next week to do something about this, what do you think that should be?
I would target the reduction of our prison population by about 70%, because if you were to make that a target, you would see crime fall like a stone in our society. And if the government wants another suggestion or two, which should come from my book, there are these. Start legalising drugs. Legalise, licence and regulate the supply of drugs, because drug prohibition has only one effect: massive increases in drug use, massive numbers of extra and unnecessary drug deaths, and a huge increase in crime in society. So decriminalise and regulate and licence the supply of drugs. And finally, stop locking children away as if they are adult criminals. We do that in our society to this day. 15 and 16-year-old boys locked up, and girls in some cases, locked up in conditions that are identical to adult prisons. That is completely wrong, and the only thing it does is breed another generation of adult criminals, and we do it at public expense.
Just finally, Chris, can I just go back to what you said, reduce the prison population by 70%? So to do what with those convicted criminals instead?
Well, not send them to prison. The reason I choose that figure is because it's almost exactly 70% of those in our prisons who are non-violent offenders. They haven't harmed anyone physically. They are non-violent. They have many often committed drug-related offences or relatively low-level theft or other offences. And if you were to take them out of the prison system, you would see a reduction in recidivism, which has never been seen in any society before. Because the truth of it is that the one way that you guarantee you get more and more crime from the same group of people is to lock them up as children and keep them locked up. So the minute you have a policy which removes the use of prison as the default position and actually says we have to do something with these people in our society rather than just lock them away for a few months or a few years, then we will actually see real falls in crime, and we'll see a culture shift in our society away from the revolving door of prison and into a situation where people can make some mistakes in their youth and young life and they can still come out of it, get an education and get a job. And that's what we should want from our criminal justice society, not ever-increasing numbers locked away in prison.
That was Chris Daw QC speaking to me earlier. He is a criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers and the author of the book Justice on Trial.